You know how history sometimes just shifts
Mm-hmm.
really fast? Well, you might be following the news thinking you've got a handle on things right now, but believe me, there's a lot to unpack.
There really is.
So today, we're doing a deep dive into Donald Trump's second presidency, specifically the early phase, right? What's happened from Inauguration Day, January 20th, up to today, April 17th, 2025?
Exactly. And for this, we've really pulled together quite a range of sources. We're
Yeah.
talking the Wikipedia entry, which is, constantly updating, but also lots of news articles, different analyses tracking everything since January.
Yeah, it's been rapid fire. So our mission here is pretty straightforward.
Mm.
Cut through all that noise. We
Mm.
want to pull out the most important, maybe the most surprising things from these first few months.
Yeah.
Help you get a clear sense of the key shifts, the impacts, without feeling,
Well,
overwhelmed.
everything from a fire hose, yeah.
Exactly. Okay, so it seems pretty obvious the administration came in ready to go. No time wasted.
Oh, definitely. I mean, the first thing that jumps out is just the sheer volume of executive orders
Wait, on day one.
on day one. Sources say more than any previous president signed on their first day.
Wow.
So that immediately signaled, a strategy based on fast unilateral executive action.
And these weren't just like minor tweaks, were they?
Not at all.
The sources suggest many were pretty controversial. They kicked off legal fights almost instantly.
That's a really key point. The legal pushback was intense right away.
How intense?
We're talking over 100 lawsuits just in the first month.
100.
Yeah. Covering everything from immigration changes, firing officials, slashing the federal workforce, you name it.
So the courts have been busy.
Very busy. It really underscores how contentious these early moves were.
One of the big early actions, the sources really highlight this, was clemency for January 6th participants.
That was significant. Around 1,500 pardons, plus commuting 14 sentences.
And that included people involved in violence against police officers.
It did. Which, that's a major step. It raises questions about, rule of law, political violence.
Definitely. And does this tie into that Project 2025 thing we've heard about?
Very much so. According to many sources, Project 2025 is this detailed policy roadmap from conservative groups.
Right.
And what's really striking is that apparently almost 2/3 of those early executive actions directly mirrored proposals from that project.
So not exactly spontaneous. It suggests a pre-planned agenda being rolled out.
Precisely. A very deliberate implementation of a specific vision.
But it's not just what they did, it's how, right? The legality seems to be a major issue.
Yeah, that's where it gets really interesting. Legal scholars, looking at the sources, they're saying several early orders seem to just ignore or even violate existing laws, regulations.
Even the Constitution.
Even the Constitution in some assessments, which obviously brings up huge questions about presidential power.
Okay, so we're hearing about the scope of executive power being tested.
Exactly. And some experts, political scientists, are describing these moves against sort of civil society structures as potentially authoritarian.
Authoritarian, that's a strong word.
It is. They're talking about democratic backsliding. So it goes beyond just policy disagreements into the basic functioning of government.
Okay, let's maybe shift gears a bit.
Mm-hmm.
Another huge area of activity seems to be the federal workforce itself.
Oh, absolutely. Big changes there.
What kind of changes?
Well, it's sort of a multi-pronged thing. First, an immediate hiring freeze across the government.
Okay.
Then, an order ending telework for federal employees. They had 30 days to return to the office.
That must have caused some disruption.
You'd imagine so.
Mm-hmm.
But the really big one, perhaps, is reclassifying lots of career civil service jobs.
Reclassifying how?
To make them at-will positions, which for listeners basically means stripping away traditional job protection.
So they could be fired more easily, potentially making the civil service more political.
That's the implication, yes. More influence for political appointees, less independence for career staff.
And the scale of this,
Yeah.
did it actually lead to terminations?
Massively. Sources report over 30,000 federal employees terminated by late February.
30,000, that's huge.
It's described as unprecedented and potentially legally questionable, too. You have to think about the loss of expertise, institutional knowledge.
Right. How did they justify this legally?
Well, the administration put forward this novel legal interpretation. They basically expanded the definition of national security functions within agencies.
Allowing them more leeway.
Seemingly. It also allowed them to label some federal workers' unions as hostile.
Hostile. That sounds like it escalates things with the unions.
It does. And then came that late March executive order.
What did that do?
It excluded dozens of departments and agencies from federal labor management relations programs,
So undermining collective bargaining.
potentially impacting maybe 1 million employees. And yes, the goal seems to be challenging collective bargaining rights. Lawsuits followed immediately trying to protect those agreements.
Wow. Okay, and this was happening alongside other cultural shifts within government. DEI, for example.
Yes, simultaneously. An order came down to end diversity, equity, and inclusion projects.
What happened to the staff in those offices?
Reports say they were placed on leave, and they also rescinded Executive Order 11246.
Remind me what that one did.
That was the long-standing order requiring affirmative action for federal contractors.
So a significant rollback there, too. And what about this Department of Government Efficiency, DOGE, with Elon Musk?
Right, DOGE. That's definitely unusual.
What's its role been?
Well, sources suggest it's had quite a bit of influence, involved in restructuring big agencies like USA, the Department of Education.
Restructuring how?
Reports mention unilateral staff firings, cutting administrative functions significantly. It seems to be the main vehicle for this push to, quote, streamline government.
But not everything went smoothly. I thought I read about courts stepping in somewhere.
You did. A federal court put a pause on attempts to dismantle the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, the CFPB.
Okay, so there is some pushback working through the system.
Yes, it shows that legal and institutional checks are still operating. But the broader trend, looking across the sources,
What's the trend?
it appears to be an effort to bring traditionally independent bodies much more directly under executive control, often cutting them down significantly.
Any other examples?
The Wilson Center is mentioned as apparently being gutted, significantly reduced in scope and staff.
Okay, let's broaden out to domestic policy. The economy inherited was showing some okay signs.
Yeah, the general consensus in the sources is that the Biden administration handed over an economy with growing GDP, low unemployment, inflation coming down.
But the new policies had an immediate effect.
It seems so, particularly the new tariffs, widespread tariffs on imports.
And the impact was negative.
Reports point to pretty large drops in consumer sentiment. Inflation expectations ticked back up.
And the stock market.
There was that crash, or at least significant downturn, in April after the global tariffs were fully detailed. So, yeah, a quick shift in the economic mood.
Right. Beyond trade, what else? Grants. Research.
Reports mention cancellations and pauses on various federal grants and large cuts to scientific research funding.
Okay. And environmental policy. Sounds like a big reversal there.
Yeah.
A very clear one. Appointing lobbyists from oil, gas, chemical industries to top EPA spots.
To do what?
Tasked specifically with reversing climate regulations, rolling them back.
And the National Energy Emergency Declaration, what was that about?
That gave the administration power to suspend environmental rules, make it easier to extract fossil fuels, and actually limit renewable energy projects.
Limit renewables.
Yes. And they also kicked off a review of the EPA's endangerment finding.
Which is the basis for regulating greenhouse gases, right?
Exactly. The legal underpinning. Plus, formally withdrawing from the Paris Agreement again.
So a complete U-turn on climate.
Pretty much signals that, yes.
What about social issues? DEI again. Yes, a major focus, blaming DEI and wokeness for various societal problems, dismantling those pro-diversity policies we mentioned.
And also targeting transgender people.
Reports indicate aggressive moves against trans individuals and what the administration terms gender ideology.
And this extends beyond government, using executive orders to influence wider society.
It seems so. Threats or warnings to cultural institutions, universities.
About what?
About their DEI policies, how they handle anti-Semitism, even pressure on law firms.
Pressure on law firms? How?
To align with the administration's political positions, apparently, reshaping civil society through executive action.
Let's pivot to immigration.
Yep.
Clearly a top priority from day one.
Absolutely. The sources detail immediate instructions flying out.
Like what?
Summary deportations at the border, disabling the CBP One app.
That was the appointment app for asylum seekers.
Yes, reinstating the Remain in Mexico policy, designating drug cartels as terrorist groups, restarting border wall construction, just bang, bang, bang.
So a lot of immediate action. Did it translate into immediate results on the ground?
Well, interestingly, arrest and deportation rates initially lagged behind the administration's stated goals, according to reports.
Why is that? Implementation challenges.
It seems so. Making these big changes actually happen on the ground takes time and resources.
How did the deportation efforts proceed then? Were there phases?
Reports suggest phases, yes. starting with people on pre-existing target lists,
Okay.
then moving to remove asylum applicants more broadly, revoking parole status for people who entered via CBP-1 or the CHNV parole process.
CHNV.
That's the process for Cubans, Haitians, Nicaraguans, and Venezuelans.
Got it. And challenging birthright citizenship. Was that pursued?
Exploring legal ways to do that, yes, and suspending the entire U.S. refugee admissions program.
Wow. Okay. And then there was the use of the Alien Enemies Act. That sounds old.
It is, from 1798. Reports say it was used to detain migrants without trial.
Where?
At a facility reportedly set up in El Salvador, the Terrorism Confinement Center.
And who was being sent there?
Migrants, including some with no criminal records. One case was apparently due to an administrative error. Raises huge due process questions.
Huge. And were others being targeted too? Not just undocumented migrants.
Reports mention activists, legal immigrants, even tourists and students on visas being targeted.
For what reason?
For criticizing policies or supporting Palestine, according to the sources.
That's quite a reach.
Yeah.
And then that incident in April, declaring living immigrants dead.
Yes, that was alarming. The administration and DOGE reportedly flagged about 6,300 living immigrants as deceased in the Social Security Death Master file.
Why would they do that?
The stated aim, or the reported aim, was to induce self-deportation.
How would that work?
By cutting them off from banking, credit, essentially making life impossible.
That's extraordinary.
Yeah.
Okay, shifting to foreign policy, the theme seems to be America first.
Very much so. And
Yeah.
sources use a lot of different words to describe it. Imperialist, expansionist, isolationist, autarkist, a real mix. But the core seems to be transactional relationships.
With allies too.
Yes, often strained. Reports even mention threats of annexation against allies, which is highly unusual.
Highly. What about international organizations, the WHO?
Ordered an immediate stop to U.S. funding and work with the World Health Organization.
And leaving it all together.
Announced the intention to formally withdraw, yes. A big step back from global health leadership.
What about the Middle East? Israel, Hamas?
Interestingly, sources say the incoming Trump team worked with the outgoing Biden team to broker a ceasefire just before inauguration.
But didn't hold.
No, reports say Israel broke it in March.
That meeting with Zelensky, the Ukrainian president.
Ah, yes, the televised meeting in February with Trump and Vice President Vance.
How is that described?
As unprecedentedly tense, like a public dressing down, according to media reports. Very confrontational.
A stark change in diplomacy. And economically on the world stage.
Protectionism is the word. Those sweeping tariffs we mentioned, China, Canada, Mexico, and suspending U.S. payments to the World Trade Organization.
So pulling back from global trade bodies too.
Seems to be the direction.
Okay, let's talk personnel. Who's getting appointed? What's the criteria?
The consistent theme in reports is personal loyalty to President Trump being paramount.
Over expertise sometimes?
That's the assessment in some cases, yes. Loyalty seems key for cabinet posts, and Elon Musk's role is still significant.
Very much so. Still a special government employee running DOGE.
With access across government, reports indicate access to numerous federal agencies, even critical financial systems, which is quite something for a non-traditional appointee.
And the relationship with the judiciary, it sounds like it's gotten worse.
Considerably strained, yes. Following court rulings against administration actions.
What's the reaction been?
Increased public criticism of judges from the president, even calls for impeachment of judges who rule against him.
Impeachment, that's serious.
It is. And beyond judges, reports mention threats, executive actions, investigations targeting political opponents, critics, Democratic-aligned groups.
Using government power against opponents.
That's the concern being raised, yes. Concerns about a potential constitutional crisis.
Why a constitutional crisis?
Because of reported defiance of court orders, asserting a right to disobey the courts.
That is fundamental. And targeting lawyers, too.
Yes. Reports describe actions against law firms and specific lawyers who previously represented clients against Trump's interests. That's seen as unprecedented.
Wow. A lot of pressure on democratic institutions.
That's certainly the fear expressed in many analyses, questions about separation of powers, rule of law.
Okay, finally, let's touch on rhetoric and the media. Has the approach changed much?
Sources point to clear continuity with past patterns.
Like the birther stuff.
Exactly. That kind of rhetoric, false attacks on opponents' identities, and the adversarial stance toward the press continues.
The fake news accusations.
Yes. Though, ironically, his 2016 run benefited hugely from free media.
True. But his first term saw fewer press briefings, didn't it?
It did. And revoking some reporters' credentials, though courts restored them, defamation suits against news outlets failed, but the relationship remained hostile.
Has it escalated in the second term?
The rhetoric seems to have, yes. Reports mention language supporting the outlying of political dissent,
Outlawing dissent?
suggestions of prosecuting reporters, threatening broadcast licenses for unfavorable coverage.
Actual actions taken.
Post-re-election, reports mention lawsuits and blacklists against media outlets, taking over the White House Correspondents Association credentialing process,
So controlling access.
and FCC investigations into alleged anti-Trump bias at networks, more direct pressure.
Okay, so with all this happening, what's the public mood? Any polling data?
Gallup had a poll right around the inauguration.
What did it show?
Approval at 47%, disapproval at 48%. Pretty evenly split overall.
But divided underneath.
Extremely polarized. 91% approval among Republicans, but only 6% among Democrats.
Wow, that's a huge gap. Really highlights the division.
Deep, deep polarization.
Okay, so wrapping up this whirlwind deep dive, some big themes are definitely emerging.
Yeah, I think so.
Rapid, sweeping changes across the board. Immediate and numerous legal fights. Huge shifts in the federal workforce. Aggressive immigration enforcement.
A very different foreign policy stance.
Right. Strained relationships with courts, the press, traditional institutions, and that consistent, often controversial rhetoric.
That sums it up pretty well. And it's crucial, again, for listeners to remember, this is based on info up to today, April 17th.
Right, it's a moving target.
Very much so, constantly evolving.
Which leads us to the final thought for you, the listener, to maybe chew on. Given just how fast and how broad these changes have been, what do you think the most lasting impact of this second Trump term might be?
Yeah, on the structure of American government, its place in the world.
Or maybe, with all the legal battles and the public reaction being so divided, what future paths could unfold from here? What trajectories seem possible?
It definitely gives you a lot to consider.
Indeed. We really encourage you to keep following this, look at different sources, and keep thinking critically as it all plays out.
Absolutely. Staying informed, thinking for yourself, it's more vital than ever.